Hi everyone, this is Peter. I want to just continue my discussion of the Odyssey in a sort of second part video, following along in the book Classical Mythology, Images and Insights by Harris and Platzner. And again, sorry about the Powell thing. I have to find my copy of Powell to build on this some more. Both are great books for introduction to these themes. Last time we checked in on the Odyssey and Odysseus in particular. We talked about basically how he constitutes a very different type of example of the Greek hero. In some senses, the unheroic Greek hero. This can even, for example, be sort of illustrated by his weapon of choice, and that is, as most spectacularly seen at the very end, spoiler alert, where he strings and then shoots his bow. Odysseus's skill with the bow and arrow is what sets him apart. And in the Greek tradition, such a weapon is, I think, looked at with a certain amount of skepticism and suspicion regarding the lack of commitment compared to traditional hand-to-hand combat using swords or spears. So just even in the basic sense of combat, he's somewhat removed from the traditional Ajax, Achilles, Agamemnon type of heroism. However, it's more than that. It's very clear, again, using that that little header right here of brains versus brawn, that Odysseus has extraordinary skills in speaking and in intellect, and he is able to adapt readily to almost any circumstance, especially with the aid of Athena going throughout the story. He changes appearances as this sort of shape-shifting aspect, but it's more than just his appearance. It's his ability to kind of rhetorically be able to handle easily and competently just about any situation he finds himself in, whether he is a kind of important leader among the Greek troops outside the walls of Troy, or whether he is, the washed-up sort of castaway on the shores of Phaeacia, or the anonymous beggar, basically, when he returns to Ithaca. But it's also worth pointing out along the same lines that it's not that straightforward. That is to say that he has these skills, and as the example that we're looking at here, this text describes prudence, self-awareness, foresight. He doesn't always do a great job with that. It's certainly true that Achilles has a much more vivid temper, and that certainly really provides the entire kind of foregrounding of the Iliad. There's no question that Odysseus makes a number of less than appropriate decisions, let's put it that way, in the course of his return back to Ithaca. So, yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about, the brains versus brawn differential. It's, again, significant that of the three kind of great heroes of the Iliad, Agamemnon, Achilles, and Ajax, none of them return home. So why does Odysseus get back? Is it because ultimately he has to recognize that the heroic age in a very real sense is over, and that a different kind of attitude, different kind of approach to the problems of basically life is required? A good example of one of those significant errors that shows that Odysseus's intellect is not entirely sufficient in itself to deal with the challenges and situations he's going to encounter on the way back is, of course, his error with Polyphemus. There's a number of errors involved with this, and these are, this is one of the most significant of the episodes he relates about his travels. He decides to explore a cave. This is really not a thing that, honestly, any anyone who's interested in getting home after 10 years away at Troy really needs to do. But he has, and this is a definitely consistent characteristic of his, he has this sort of insatiable curiosity that needs to be satisfied to some degree. And so he and his men go into the cave of the Cyclops, as it happens, Polyphemus. Polyphemus is not interested in the famed Greek laws of hospitality, where Zeus is supposed to look over travelers who need accommodation or some other type of help on their way. In fact, Polyphemus in the poem makes it abundantly clear that Zeus has no jurisdiction, which is a kind of presumption that Polyphemus will pay for, mostly at the hands of Odysseus. But for the time being, it's not going to help much, and indeed, Polyphemus starts off by basically eating Odysseus's men. And he's going to keep on doing this. This is a situation that's untenable, and so Odysseus needs to come up with a solution. He can't fight his way out of this. There are obviously many number of kind of interesting symbolic aspects involved, getting trapped in a cave with a one-eyed monster, but we'll set that to one side. He basically comes up with a plan, to blind the Cyclops Polyphemus, and this indeed happens. And Polyphemus sort of deals with this by basically very carefully letting out his herds of sheep and inspecting them as they go by, counting them, and basically locking Odysseus and his men in the cave. So basically there's no real clear way out. How's he going to do this? Well, in essence, the only way he figures he can do it is it's a pretty clever plan, is to tie his men underneath these sheep. And he himself is going to hang on tight after tying his men. And basically they get out. That's the main thing. But unfortunately, having succeeded in this extraordinary stratagem, he indulges himself by basically broadcasting to Polyphemus and anyone else in hearing. He'd previously identified himself as, basically the translation would be from Nemo, N-E-M-O, to no man or nobody. Actually identifies himself and says, hey, anybody asks who did this to you, it was Odysseus who lives in Ithaca. And this is a really, really bad idea, because Cyclops' father is Poseidon, who's going to govern the sea. And so he's in a whole lot of trouble, basically for the remainder of his voyage. And not only that, not only is he in trouble, but also his men are in trouble. And it is worth noting, spoiler alert, that the only person who returns to Ithaca alive is indeed Odysseus himself. He's not necessarily the best, the best leader, not somebody you want to link up with if you want to come back. He, I think, after that episode, certainly, as this text puts it, tends to behave a whole lot more carefully. And the prudence thing certainly comes out, for example, when indeed he runs into the Phaeacians in Nausicaa, where he's washed up, naked, beaten by the waves, completely devoid of any sign or insignia of rank or identity, and is very careful in terms of how he handles himself. With the Phaeacian court, the king and the rest, and then B, when he is transported back to Ithaca, and here the patronage and guidance and actual assistance of Athena is certainly going to be critical. He basically has transformed himself into the kind of lowest of the low, maybe not a slave, but certainly not an aristocrat, not somebody who would have any claim, for instance, to status, rank, privilege of any kind. It is significant when he reaches that point in his travels, when he's back in Ithaca, that he's basically going to have to rely on the assistance of women. A good example of one of those women is going to be Eurycleia, his nursemaid, who identifies him but doesn't betray him. Obviously, Penelope, eventually, once he reveals his identity to her, will be critical. And that aspect of the feminine is pretty important and distinctive, as we mentioned already, with regard to the Odyssey. A good example of the power of women in terms of the divine is going to be Circe, and also Calypso. Circe, who is has this extraordinarily magical power, and as the text points out from the poem, gives him the power to instructions to deal with travel to the underworld to figure out what he's going to do next. And this is an extraordinary journey indeed. And again, speaking of women, his consultation with his mother, Anticlea, or even, interestingly enough, the prophet Tiresias, who himself has been both male and female, indicates his ability to, kind of in a sense, at least, transcend gender and see the world from multiple angles. Again, that man of many turns. Other aspects that are important in the poem as we close out. There's a great deal more. Obviously, we can't cover everything that we possibly could. The final, in a sense, encounter, there's so much here with the sirens. Again, Calypso, Nausicaa is another truly important female figure. Probably the final encounter with Penelope might be another one to think about. Penelope is an individual who has, a great deal of courage. That is to say, she kind of displays arete, even though she's not male. She has this extraordinarily dangerous situation that she finds herself in, basically designs upon her at the hands of the suitors, the young men of Ithaca, who basically want to take her property and her as property, as basically a sexual kind of object. How is she going to, be able to maneuver in this space? And again, remember, it's a very closed domestic space. She initially fools the suitors by weaving and then unweaving, and obviously weaving is the sort of one of the patron areas, if you will, one of the sort of sanctioned activities of Athena, weaving and unweaving a funeral shroud, a burial shroud for Odysseus, and this goes on for quite a while until they discover it. Sorry, not for Odysseus, for Laertes. And the other interesting thing that near the end is she even tests this stranger who claims to be Odysseus by basically divulging or testing him on the circumstances of their actual bed, which is, again, spoiler alert, set up in a certain way, let's just put it that way, that Odysseus recognizes and she recognizes, and only at that point is she willing to, accept that this stranger is in fact her husband finally returned. And mythologically, it's very satisfying the ways in which Odysseus, in essence, changes from a kind of, what's the right word, scheming, calculating, clever, and very dangerous individual. I mean, he still is dangerous, as the suitors find to their sorrow, but very, in a sense, masculine hero in the Iliad, to a much more well-rounded and complex character in the Odyssey. One of the most striking scenes, I think, in the Odyssey is his encounter with his father, Laertes. You have this kind of, 3 generations, Telemachus and Laertes, the aged Laertes tending his garden, as a kind of a foreshadowing of the fate that Odysseus himself will encounter as he ages and dies.